details about policing reforms here in Indianapolis and Marion County. We'll take you to that news conference in just a moment. First, expected also to hear from an NYU professor that they've been consulting with as well in New York. Let's listen in live.
We are emerging into a new day of justice for the city of Indianapolis. It would not have happened without large, peaceful demonstrations by residents of every race, age, and background. Today, I would like to outline two additional and new efforts to address this moment. First, we are committed to a thorough review of events that took place during the beginning of protests. Early this month, after two turbulent nights, protest organizers and city leaders ensured that demands for justice would not be obscured by destruction. Since then, we have seen marches, sit-ins, and demonstrations that are without precedent in our city. However, important questions remain. Two tragic murders are still under investigation. Video footage has revealed police-protester interactions that have shocked our community and raised legitimate questions about the policies that produced those moments. Today, I want to spend time talking about how we move forward as a city. But it is clear we cannot do that without also undertaking a full review of what has occurred. So today, I am initiating an independent review of our city's response to protests that took place from late May and into early June. This independent and external review is separate both from IMPD's administrative review of the individual officers' alleged conduct, as well as the prosecutor's criminal investigation. This will be an independent third-party review that will provide a transparent and frank assessment of city policy and law enforcement actions during the protests, as well as recommendations for the future. In the coming days, I will announce the leadership structure for this external review. I will then ensure that this committee has the resources necessary to ensure independent staffing. And I ask that this analysis be thorough, transparent, and swift. Through this report, we will learn from what has occurred. We will better prepare ourselves for the future, and we will provide much deserved answers to questions that have arisen. Turning now to our second major effort announced today in the wake of protests. Ever since I raised my right hand and was first sworn in as mayor, I have challenged our administration and I have challenged myself to think boldly about how we can address the systemic challenges posed by our criminal justice system. Since that time, we have dismantled an antiquated Department of Public Safety and replaced it with a new office focused on crime as a symptom of a much larger public health crisis. We doubled the amount of funding and resources aimed at community programming and violence reduction efforts through grassroots organizations. We marshaled public safety and healthcare resources to better address mental health and addiction. That included prioritizing treatment over jailing through several new efforts like the Assessment and Intervention Center at our new Community Justice Campus, the Rubin Engagement Center, mobile crisis assistance teams, mandatory implicit bias training for our officers, as well as new initiatives aimed at education and employment, such as Project Indy and Indy Achieves. We did all of this to foster a safer and more equitable city. But we are not done. In this historic moment, residents expect a more fundamental assessment of public safety in the city of Indianapolis. So this afternoon, I'm very pleased to be joined by former New Jersey Attorney General and law professor Anne Milgram. From 2007 to 2010, Anne led the effort to reform policing in Camden, New Jersey, injecting broader sets of data and evidence into decisions around fighting crime and making communities safer. Anne is currently a professor and distinguished scholar in residence at New York University's School of Law. Previously, she served as the Vice President of Criminal Justice with the Laura and John Arnold Foundation, where she led the creation, development, and national implementation of a pretrial risk assessment tool that helps judges and prosecutors make data-driven decisions. Today, we are announcing a partnership between the City of Indianapolis and the New York University School of Law Criminal Justice Lab. Through this partnership, it is our intention to help chart a new path forward for our city's approach to public safety, one that is made for, by, and of the people of Indianapolis. This project will serve as a catalyst for a new community-driven and community-monitored vision of justice in Indianapolis. Anyone paying attention knows this is a defining moment in our city and in our nation's history. The community is clearly speaking, demanding not just that we do better, but that the community be a central part of the process. Through the participation of community stakeholders, as well as public input coordinated by Community Solutions, Inc., this new partnership will be shaped by those it intends to serve, the public. It will proceed in 5 broad steps. First, we will bring together stakeholders from every facet of public health, and that starts with community members. It also includes public defenders, health workers, educators, law enforcement, social service providers, housing agencies, and others. Together, with their combined perspective, they will create a new definition of justice and public safety that represents equitable treatment under the law. Second, this project requires that we broaden the sets of data we use to define public safety. Arrest records and statistics on crime are necessary, but they are also incomplete. If the rates of high school graduation, substance abuse, and mental illness all contribute to public safety, then that information must be accounted for and shared among all entities that ensure public safety. Third, data analysts will help track and monitor these relevant public safety metrics. Findings will not only be used to hold law enforcement and city agencies accountable, but those agencies will be held to a standard that is defined by the community. I realize that on paper, that may sound bureaucratic and academic, with all due respect to Attorney General Milgram, but it won't be. It can't be. Because the ultimate goal here isn't to analyze, but to act. Which brings us to the 4th step. Proposed changes to public safety policies based on the above findings. Proposals will be presented both to our criminal justice agencies and to the City County Council. And I've made it clear to the City County Council and city leadership that nothing is off limits. We must let the scope of the challenge dictate the boldness of the changes necessary to address it. Fifth and finally, this partnership will regularly generate community-driven report cards, ensuring members of the public that they can hold city county government accountable for the changes that we make. Recent events have revealed scars of mistrust that have existed between communities of color and city government for a long time. It is important that we in positions of power recognize that. It is also important that those of us who do not know this mistrust firsthand still know where it comes from, so that this moment is not misinterpreted. There are Black residents living in Indianapolis today who were denied admittance to city pools when they were children in the 1960s. There are Black residents alive today who saw their neighborhoods bulldozed for the interstate back in the 1970s. There are Black residents today who remember the protests surrounding Michael Taylor in 1987. I could go on, but my point is this. The mistrust we see today has roots that are both shallow and deep. If any resident feels mistrust is unwarranted, and you haven't heard of the examples I just mentioned, you have an obligation to learn from and a responsibility to listen to your community. A Black child in a tough neighborhood should not suffer greater consequences for the same mistake suffered or made by a white child in a wealthy neighborhood. However, when we look at the data, very often that is indeed the case. Well, now the data will be part of the process. And when inequities are revealed, we must act. These are challenging times. I've lost count of how often I've used the word unprecedented in the last 3 months. I know we are all under an incredible amount of stress. It has caused anger. It has caused confusion. It has caused hostility. But there are Black residents in our city fighting a fight that should not have made it into this century. We must, as a city, work for unprecedented equality among all communities in Indianapolis. Now is the time for courage. Now is the time for kindness. Now is the time for action. And most assuredly, now is the time for change. It is my honor now to present to you and introduce Professor Ann Milgram. Professor.
Thank you so much, Mayor, and thank you for this partnership. I, like so many others, have been filled in the past few weeks with both sadness and anger as we've watched these events unfold across our country. Unlike many people, though, I have a level of hope that is based on my work with the Camden, New Jersey Police Department and in the city of Camden that I think many people don't have. And that is because we literally took the city of Camden from the most dangerous city in America to a city today that has crime lower than it's been in over 50 years, with a deep level of community synergy. It's not us versus them in Camden. It is the police of the city with the people of the city. And it's also a model of accountability. And so we're really grateful to you for this partnership, because in all truthfulness, this is the first time in my career, outside of my experience with Camden, where I've felt that there is the real possibility of systemic change. And I know, as you do, and as the chief knows and others, that the public, we need the consent of the public to govern, and that the legitimacy of our police departments, our public safety institutions, and really all of our government depends on being a part of and with the community. And so what drives me forward, and I think what is so exciting about this project, is the idea that there are three things that are happening. The first is that our system, there is bias, there is discrimination in our system, and our systems are just, they've been very difficult to reform, and that is long overdue. And so that's a conversation that all of us need to have. The second is that we have been deeply reactive as government, as law enforcement, and I count myself as law enforcement, having both overseen the police department and been a local and a federal prosecutor, including a civil rights prosecutor, but we've been really reactive. We've seen crime as the thing. We've seen public safety as related to crime. And I think in my lifetime now, for the first time, people are starting to understand that we can't just be reactive, that crime is really the end result of many other things. And there are many other things driving safety in our community. And frankly, when I talk to folks in communities, they often talk about whether their kids are safe walking to school, whether a particular park is a safe park for their kids to play in. And we haven't brought that into the fabric of our departments and how we think about safety in America to the extent that I think we have to and we must. And finally, I think it's worth noting that we really, in my view, because we've put a lot on the police and we've waited to react until something bad has happened, we haven't looked enough at what drives crime and really how everything is interrelated. And so I like to think about this as it's not just the social determinants of health, it's also the social determinants of crime, and really it's the social determinants of everything. And so how can we have a conversation about what public safety means without having that be community driven and without having that be inclusive of people who run the Department of Education and the Housing Department and the Health Department? Because so much of what we see downstream relates to the actions that we take upstream. And so the first piece of this, as you said, is really got to be, how do we redefine what public safety is? We have to let the community come in and tell us what they value, what's important. We have to have the hard kinds of conversations about, if somebody's mentally ill, what's the right response? Is it a law enforcement response? Is it a social work response? And we have to put all of those things together to start really saying, what is that definition, and how should we measure ourselves? Is it fair to hold the chief of police accountable for everything, when maybe if we improve high school graduation rates, we can dramatically improve the safety in our community too? So it's a different kind of conversation that has to be community driven, and it has to be rooted in accountability by redefining what it means to have equity and justice and safety in a community, and then figuring out, how do we create the metrics around those things, a sort of report card, as you mentioned, for the city, and then driving all of us to get there and figuring out what are the reforms needed to achieve the goal of a more just and equitable and safe society. And so we're thrilled to partner with you. I want to say, absolutely, it's not going to be just talk and data and metrics, even though I love data and metrics. This is about action and transformation, but it is about action and transformation in a way that's smart, that's informed by the evidence, that is informed completely by the community, and that we are then able to take to build a better infrastructure for both public safety and governance in the community. And we're thrilled to partner with you, with the city, county council, with the chief of police and others. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor. And now it's indeed my honor to introduce Chief Randall Taylor of the Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department. Chief.
Thank you, sir. 4 years ago, our city embarked on a path to improve outcomes of the criminal justice system. to connect with residents suffering from mental illness and addiction with treatment rather than a jail cell, and to make our neighborhoods safer. That process gave us the mobile crisis assistance teams, which pair a highly trained officer with a mental health clinician to de-escalate and address the root cause of why an individual might find themselves in crisis. It gave us the soon-to-be opened Assessment and Intervention Center, which will divert individuals suffering from these illnesses from the criminal justice system. It allowed us to provide CIT and mental health first aid training to IMPD officers who serve our city. This process led to change. It led to progress in our community and for this police department. It helped reduce the burden on our officers. But we recognize that to truly improve the lives of all who live in and serve this city, that progress must accelerate. I know that the vast majority of women and men on our police department joined our ranks to help and uplift their neighbors. But this moment requires that we reevaluate the system of justice that we are a part of and the role that we play in our community. That's why today we begin again to look forward to identify and embrace the best practices that will allow us to better serve our city and to work alongside our residents to define what public safety should look like in Indianapolis, to shape a city where prevention takes precedence over enforcement, where law enforcement, community service providers, researchers, and the community truly work in partnership. A city where every resident can trust the criminal justice system and every neighborhood feels safe. I want to personally thank our community members who have made their voices heard and shared their vision for change, and to the officers of this department who have worked tirelessly to serve our community despite difficult circumstances. Indianapolis is a great city, and I know that by working together, we can and will make it an even better place to call home. Thank you, sir.
Once again, if you will put your name and outlet into the Q&A box, I'm happy to call upon you. Our first question is from Abdul Hakim Shabazz at Indy Politics. We can hear you, Abdul.
Okay. My question, Mr. Mayor, Professor, maybe you can help us out too, is at the end of the day, what's the point of all this? What's the long-term strategy? I've been in this town a long time. Remember Mayor Peterson had a similar study. Mayor Ballard had a similar study. You folks have done things similar in the past. What's going to be different about this, and what realistic results can residents expect to see that's going to make their lives easier? Because if you ask most people, a lot of them are worried about the murder rate and the crime as opposed to the protesters.
Well, Abdul, I can't speak to the two studies that you referred to, Mayor Peterson and Mayor Ballard, but I will tell you that we are at a critical juncture in our city's history, in our state and country's history, and we need to do everything that we can to take advantage of it. We're talking about essentially reimagining criminal justice. We've been working very diligently, as I said in my remarks, for 4 years to bring about holistic criminal justice reform. But the last several weeks have underscored the need to do even more, take more steps. As Dr. King said, take advantage of the fierce urgency of now. The people of our city demand it. And as a result, over the course of the last several weeks, over the course of this week and the next several weeks, we'll be announcing even more efforts to bring about the types of reforms that the people of Indianapolis demand. Ann, do you have any further comments?
I would add a couple of things to that. First, I think that we have seen reforms and we've seen reform commissions. This is not meant to be a commission or a task force. This is meant to be an opportunity for the community to speak loud and clearly on what public safety means to them. And frankly, to move away, which we have never done, from the types of things that we have always measured, like in a police department, arrests, in a prosecutor's office, convictions, in a court, sentences and things like that, and really sort of draw back to asking what makes communities safe. How do we make communities safe in a way that's just and fair? When do we use the police? When do we not use the police? And it is meant to be systemic in a way that I would even argue a lot of the national conversation is really about. When you start thinking about training and policies alone, you're really thinking about keeping the existing framework of criminal justice. And what we're having the conversation here about is we want to revisit what that underlying framework should even be and how it should operate. And so I think that's so important. I also personally can tell you what drives me in my work is always how do you have public safety in a community and how do you do it in a way that is just and equitable and fair. I would point you to Camden and my work there. I will tell you, the chief there, he and I were on for a long time this morning, and he has said it himself many times. It's simple, but it's hard. And so we have to keep our eye both on keeping communities safe at the same time as we have to revisit and essentially restructure how we do criminal justice in America.
Eric Berman, WIBC.
Hello, can you hear me? Hello?
We can hear you. Yep.
Excellent. Question for the mayor on the review of the protest and for Professor Milgram on the partnership going forward. Mr. Mayor, how is this going to be different from the review that the prosecutor's office is pursuing? And do you have some guidance as far as who is going to carry this out, who would be that independent source? And Professor Milgram, you said in your opening remarks that this is the first opportunity since Camden for a city to do that kind of reform. What is it that makes Indy particularly suited to this? There are a lot of cities looking at how to rethink policing. What makes Indy the appropriate laboratory?
Professor, why don't you take his question, and then I'll end with the first question Eric asked.
Great. So we've had the opportunity to partner with Indianapolis over the past few years on some of their mental health work. And what the mayor said, we've experienced firsthand that the city has been a leader in thinking in innovative ways about how to address things like mental health, substance abuse, and homelessness, which the police, which often drives crime in communities. And so we've found the city to be innovative, and we've had great partnerships with the folks at Community Solutions, with the mayor's office, with the police department. And really, the question for me is always, a lot of people say the right things, but the question really is, this work is hard, as I just said, and when the rubber meets the road, having people who are of good intentions isn't enough. It has to be people who are willing to get it done. And so we really looked at that partnership that we've had with the city, our relationships in the city, and our belief that every single person who's going to be involved really wants to do the right thing and is willing to potentially give up power to make things better, right? And to change the way the government works. And that part, I can tell you firsthand from Camden, is the hardest part in some ways. And so we felt really comfortable with Indianapolis because of the leadership in mental health and in the police department and other spaces.
Well, thank you, Professor. As it relates to, Eric, your first question, the announcement today of a third-party independent review, I have charged Tim Moriarty, counsel to the mayor, to oversee those efforts. So I think he's on the line with us, and I'd pitch it to Tim to update us as to where we are in the organization of that effort.
Yeah, so in the coming days, we'll roll out a structure of how the independent review will take place. We'll also roll out the time frame that we're looking at. And Eric, in terms of your initial question, though, the way this will be different is what Prosecutor Mears is doing and what IMPD is doing are looking at the various and particular incidents that occurred, some of them high profile. Those situations will obviously be a part of this, but I actually think this is a more holistic view of the entire period and looking at how IMPD and the city of Indianapolis responded to the protests and what the perspective was of both officers and protesters. And I think the end goal is we want to learn from that going forward. And I think that dialogue is important. I think some of it you're seeing take place on Twitter, and we want to formalize that process and hear from everybody so we can learn. At the end of the day, that's what this is about, is us learning. And so, as I said, in the coming weeks moving forward, you'll hear from us more about the structure and timing. But in terms of overall, again, to summarize, in terms of overall approach, this is broader and isn't limited to a particular series or particular incident.
Richard Essex, Wish TV.
Good morning, Mayor. Good afternoon, Mayor. I've got a couple questions for you. Going back to the Community Solutions Partnership with the professor, I read a forum that she hosted back in 2018 where some people from Indianapolis went out to NYU for a forum. Professor, from the 2 or 3 years that you've been involved in Indianapolis, what are you seeing that Indianapolis needs to do right away to solve some of our issues?
So I want to leave this really to start this as a process with the community. I think that though the mayor is outlined a number of things that I actually agree very much with, which is that there's so much happening in the community that we have to both figure out how to look at what's been happening with the protests, with the police shootings, and then separately start this conversation about the criminal justice system as a whole, and really how can we re-envision it. The thing I really see, and I see this across the country, is that people are moving very quickly to react, but they're keeping the existing framework of how we think about the criminal justice system. And so the conversation is all about training in many places, or use of force policies. All of that is really important, but my sort of caution is that that alone is not enough. That will not stop these problems from happening. It will not root out systemic bias. That has to go along with accountability. And then the question is, accountability for what? And if we just use the definitions that we've set as government, or that the police chief sets or the mayor sets, we'll fail the community, because it really is about what does public safety mean in a neighborhood, in a community. And also, we really do need to have the conversation not just about the police, but about, crime is often not the thing, it's the end result of many other things. And so if we just focus on policing and that moment when we react, and again, I think it's incredibly important, and I think the city is right to move firmly in that direction. But my work here is really intended to have the broader conversation about how do we get to a point where we have equity in our society, and that we are reducing crime and improving public safety through things like metricing ourselves over whether it's high school graduation or truancy, reducing truancy, or the number of kids who are in juvenile justice facilities. There's a lot more, and frankly, it also involves, stability of housing and healthcare and all of these types of things that we talk about. So my work is meant to be broader and go beyond just the immediate pieces, which again, I think the mayor outlined and are critical. But the idea here really is, if we could build from the ground up a public safety system, what would that look like? What would the community want? And then how do we go about creating the right metrics so that we hold ourselves accountable to something beyond counting crimes and convictions, or even counting use of force policies, which we know ultimately will not get us to the place that we want for safety or justice alone.
James Briggs, Indy Star.
Professor Milgram, you wrote a piece for CNN last week describing your experience in Camden. In that piece, you wrote, quote, "For many cities and towns, building a new public safety department from scratch will be the right choice." That language seems to fit into the broadest interpretations of the defund the police discussion that's underway across America right now. Mayor and Professor Milgram both, what are your thoughts on that discussion? And is that level of change on the table here in Indianapolis as a possible outcome?
Well, to an extent, James, that's putting the cart before the horse. And obviously, this study is designed to be prospective in nature. So I don't want to step on the professor's turf here. But Tim Moriarty, do you have anything in addition from the city's perspective before we allow the professor to respond?
No, I think you're spot on, Mayor. I do think any preconceived notions does put the cart before the horse. And I think if Professor Milgram has told us anything over and over again, it's that the significant thing is to have that dialogue to begin with, and frankly, to not, as government, come into this with a particular set of policies that we are already dedicated to. I mean, and I give the example, when we started our criminal justice reform work 5 years ago, there was no such thing in our minds as the Assessment and Intervention Center. That actually came from the community dialogue. So I don't think, the way I think the mayor nailed it, I don't think there are any preconceived notions. And to the extent we have a series of preconceived notions, I think that would sort of limit the dialogue and show a lack of transparency and openness.
And I agree completely with that. I think, I wrote the piece mostly to sort of explain what had happened in Camden and to say that that isn't necessarily the right solution for all departments, but that people have to be really asking the hard questions about the ability to reform public safety and what it will take. In some communities, it will mean one thing, and in others, it will mean something completely different. And so I could not agree more with the mayor and with Tim that, we don't know where this will end. What we know is that we're committed to the process and to figuring out what needs to be done. And that's, and that will go where that, I hear the mayor saying he'll go where that leads him. And I think that's, the only commitment that we could make for sure right now.
Zach Myers, Fox 59.
Hi, if you can hear me okay, Mayor Hogsett. How do you convince folks who are marching in the streets of the city, calling for an end to racism now? How do you convince them that this partnership and study of different community factors like high school graduation rates is the path toward achieving that?
Well, it's not the only path toward achieving that, Zach. I mean, I think that many of the announcements that we've been making over these last couple of weeks have been designed to address many of the concerns that have been expressed not only in the peaceful protests, but in the evenings of looting and vandalism that occurred several weeks ago. So I think that today's two announcements are yet further drumbeats toward justice, and for all citizens of our county. So I don't mean to characterize, and I know the professor would agree. We're trying not to suggest that this is a one-size-fits-all end of the conversation that needs to take place, but rather just part of a process that begins immediately, if not several weeks ago, and that will continue, as I said, the drumbeat toward justice and toward reforming the criminal justice system in Marion County in fundamental ways. And so this is yet another step toward that end goal.
Thank you so much for joining us today. A copy of the press release will be going out momentarily. Thank you.
You've been listening to Mayor Hogsett's virtual press conference right now, talking about a reimagined, restructured criminal justice system reform, at least here in the city, and their collaboration with the NYU School of Law and Justice Lab. Well, much more on the points taken out of this press conference when we join you at News 8 at 5 and 6.